All right, welcome back for another deep dive. This one is going to be interesting. We're diving into the legal situations surrounding our newly reelected president.
Yeah,
I know a lot of you are curious how all of these different criminal and civil cases against him are going to play out now that he's back in office.
absolutely.
And believe me, this is not a simple situation. We're talking federal charges, state charges, hush money allegations, election interference, top secret documents,
It's a lot.
even some found in a bedroom, apparently.
Oh, yeah, it's enough to make your head spin, for sure.
So before we get into the weeds of all the different cases, I think it's important to get a good understanding of the overall legal framework we're dealing with here.
For sure, for sure.
So can you give us a quick overview of what we're looking at legally?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is the Department of Justice's policy on prosecuting sitting presidents.
Right.
It's important to remember this is not a law. It's a long-standing practice. Essentially, the DOJ's stance is that indicting a sitting president would interfere with their ability to carry out the duties of the office.
So it's kind of like a temporary hold on any criminal proceedings?
Yeah, you could think of it that way as a deferment, not a dismissal.
Okay.
And to make things even more complicated, a recent Supreme Court ruling has broadened the scope of presidential immunity, extending it even to personal crimes, if they have any connection to the president's official duties.
So even if, hypothetically, the president committed a crime that had nothing to do with his role as president,
Yeah.
he could still try to claim immunity.
Well, it's not always that simple.
Yeah.
But the court's decision does point towards a broad interpretation of what that presidential immunity actually means.
Right.
It sparked a lot of debate among legal scholars about where the line is drawn. It's an area of law that's still evolving.
Okay, so federal charges are essentially on hold for now. But what about state charges? I know a presidential pardon doesn't cover those, right?
Exactly. You are absolutely right. That is a critical distinction.
Mm.
A presidential pardon only applies to federal offenses.
Got it.
State-level charges are a completely separate matter. Which brings us to some very interesting cases in this situation.
Okay, so since those federal charges are basically in limbo right now, let's start there. The 2020 election interference case is probably the biggest one, right? Can you remind us what that's all about?
Sure. In that case, the president is facing 4 felony counts related to his alleged attempts to interfere with the 2020 election results.
Right, and a special counsel was appointed to oversee that investigation.
Yes, Jack Smith.
Right.
He's been leading that.
So what's the status of that case right now?
Well, a trial date was initially set for March,
Right.
but ultimately it was delayed because of those legal questions surrounding presidential immunity.
I see.
The special counsel has also indicated that he'll likely wind down the investigation now to avoid any conflicts of interest now that the president's been reelected.
So it sounds like that one's going to be on the back burner for a while.
Yeah.
What about the other big federal case, the classified documents case? That one seems pretty explosive.
Yeah, it definitely grabbed a lot of headlines. This is the case where over 100 classified documents were recovered by the FBI from the president's Mar-a-Lago residence.
Right.
Some were even found in his bedroom.
Wow.
So it was a big deal.
Okay, so where does that case stand at this point?
Well, it's at a pretty interesting place right now.
Uh-huh.
The judge assigned to the case, Judge Aileen Cannon,
Okay.
made a rather controversial ruling dismissing the charges.
Wow.
Her decision was based on concerns about how the special counsel was appointed.
Okay, so that one's not over yet either. It sounds like there are a lot more legal battles ahead for that one.
Yeah, it's hard to say what will happen next.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible the Justice Department might appeal that ruling, or they could pursue a different legal strategy.
So we've got those 2 big federal cases, both essentially in limbo for now because of the DOJ's policy and these different legal challenges.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that things get really interesting with those state charges since those aren't affected by presidential pardons.
Absolutely.
So let's move on to those now, shall we?
Sure.
The first one that comes to mind is the Stormy Daniels hush money case. If I remember correctly, there was already a guilty verdict in that one. Can you remind us what happened there?
Yes. So that case involved allegations that the president, before he took office, made hush money payments to adult film star Stormy Daniels to prevent her from going public about an alleged affair.
Right.
He was found guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records.
And this made him the first president to ever take office with a criminal record, right?
That's right. It really was an unprecedented situation, and it raised a lot of questions about the legal ramifications for a sitting president.
So what's the latest on this case? Did a sentencing ever happen?
The sentencing was initially scheduled for later this month.
Okay.
But now, with the president's reelection, there's a lot of speculation that it will be postponed.
Wow, so even though there's a guilty verdict, the legal process could still be put on hold because of his position.
It is a possibility, yeah.
Yeah.
And it brings up some really important questions about that balance of power and whether a sitting president can actually be held accountable by the justice system.
It really makes you think. And then there's that Georgia racketeering case, which sounds like something straight out of a movie. Can you give us the rundown on that one?
Sure. This case involves allegations that the president and some of his allies attempted to actually overturn the results of the 2020 election in Georgia.
Right.
It's a very complex case with a lot of moving parts, and it's received a lot of media attention, partly because of some of the, well, dramatic developments in the case.
Like what?
Well, there were allegations that the DA in charge of the case had a romantic relationship with one of the special prosecutors.
Oh, wow.
And the judge even issued a rebuke about a tremendous lapse in judgment.
It's like a soap opera.
It does add another layer of intrigue to the whole thing.
So where do things stand with that case right now?
Legally, most experts believe that the case is unlikely to proceed while the president is in office.
Okay.
It has huge political implications, too.
Hmm.
It'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds.
All right, so we've got these 4 major criminal cases now. 2 federal, 2 state, all in varying degrees of, well, limbo, you could say. Before we move on to the civil cases, I'm curious to get your take on something. We've been talking a lot about the legal complexities of all this, but I think it's important to look at the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
What do you think all of this means for the rule of law, the concept of accountability, especially when it comes to the presidency?
That is the big question, isn't it? And I think it's one that's going to be debated for years to come.
Yeah.
It raises these fundamental questions about the balance of power, the limits of presidential immunity,
Right.
and the potential for conflict of interest when a sitting president is facing these criminal charges.
Right. And what about public perception?
Yeah.
What happens to people's trust in our institutions when it seems like the president might be above the law?
Absolutely. It brings up this idea of whether justice can actually be served when legal proceedings can be delayed or even potentially influenced by political calculations.
It's a lot to think about. We've only just scratched the surface here. We still need to get to those civil cases.
Right.
And I'm sure there are a lot more nuances and potential scenarios we haven't even touched on yet.
There are.
So we're going to take a break here, regroup, and then dive into those civil cases. When we come back, we'll be exploring those potential outcomes of all these legal battles and what they could mean for the future of our nation.
Sounds good. It really is uncharted territory, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You have to wonder if the Founding Fathers ever even considered this kind of situation, a sitting president facing so many legal challenges.
I know, right? It's not exactly something they teach you in high school civics class.
No.
The Constitution does lay out the process for impeachment.
Yeah.
But that seems like it's more focused on, the high crimes and misdemeanors that happen while in office, not really issues from before they were president.
That's a great point, actually. The framers were mainly worried about misconduct that happened during the presidency, not before. And even if some of these cases do actually move forward,
Right.
removing a president through impeachment, that's a huge hurdle.
Right, because it's not just a legal process, right? It's inherently political.
Exactly. Impeachment needs a 2/3 majority vote in the Senate.
Yeah.
And given the current political landscape,
Right.
it's really unlikely that they could get that kind of supermajority no matter how strong the legal case is.
Okay, so let's play devil's advocate for a second. Let's say one of these cases does somehow make it to trial and the president is actually found guilty. What happens then? Could a sitting president actually go to jail?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Legal scholars have been debating that for decades, and there's really no easy answer.
Right.
Some argue that putting a sitting president in prison would basically overturn the results of a democratic election.
Yeah.
Create a constitutional crisis unlike anything we've ever seen.
So theoretically, we could have a situation where the president is running the country from a jail cell.
It sounds more like a movie plot than reality, I know.
Right.
But it's not totally impossible.
Right.
And it would bring up a whole host of legal and logistical questions.
Yeah. Not to mention some very interesting cabinet meetings.
Yeah.
But all jokes aside, I think this situation really highlights just how difficult it is to balance accountability and justice with the need for, stability and continuity in government.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that with all these legal battles and political maneuvering, there are real people who are affected by this.
Oh, absolutely.
including people who may have been harmed by the actions that are being alleged.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in all the legal drama and the political intrigue. But at the end of the day, there are real people involved who are seeking justice, seeking closure.
Yeah.
And for them, these delays, these legal hurdles, they can be incredibly frustrating.
Absolutely. It raises questions about fairness, whether everyone really is equal under the law, especially when it comes to people in positions of power.
What about the impact on public trust? If it seems like the president is above the law, what does that say about our democracy?
That's a huge concern.
Yeah.
This situation has the potential to really erode people's faith in our legal system and our democracy as a whole.
Right.
It underscores the importance of transparency, of accountability, and a real commitment to upholding the rule of law, no matter what your political views are.
Well said. This is a lot to process. We've gone from hush money to hypothetical presidential jail time to a potential constitutional crisis, all in one conversation. It can feel kind of overwhelming, to be honest. Where do we even go from here?
Well, I think the first step is staying informed, staying engaged. We need to pay attention to how these cases progress, ask critical questions, and demand transparency from our elected officials.
I agree. We have a responsibility as citizens to hold our leaders accountable. We can't afford to be complacent. Knowledge is power. The more we understand these issues, the better equipped we'll be to face the challenges ahead.
Exactly. This isn't a time for blind loyalty to a party. It's a time for informed citizenship. We need to approach these issues with nuance, with a willingness to consider different perspectives.
It's easy to get caught up in all the doom and gloom, but I do think there's a little bit of hope here. The fact that these cases are being pursued at all, despite all the political obstacles, it suggests that our legal system isn't completely broken.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
It shows that the pursuit of justice, even though it's imperfect, even though it's often slow, is still a driving force in our society.
Right.
It's a reminder that no one, not even the president, is above the law.
I like that. So we've talked about the federal cases, which are basically on hold, and the state cases, which are, moving forward slowly. But we haven't even gotten to those civil cases you mentioned earlier. Those are a whole other ballgame, right?
They really are. And they add another layer of complexity to this whole legal web. It's important to remember that civil cases are separate from criminal charges. And some of the people involved in these civil cases seem determined to see them through, no matter what happens with the criminal cases.
Okay, so let's dive into those now, shall we? First up, we have the lawsuits related to the January 6th Capitol riot.
Right. These are civil suits that were filed by people who were injured during the Capitol riot or who suffered damages.
Okay.
They allege that the president's actions and his rhetoric actually incited the violence.
Yeah, they really raise some tough questions about free speech, and how much a president can be held responsible for what their supporters do.
Right. A lot of gray area there for sure. What about the sexual abuse case? That one got a lot of attention in the media.
Right, that's the case brought by E. Jean Carroll. She accused the president of sexual assault.
Right.
A jury found him liable for sexual abuse and defamation.
Okay.
And ordered him to pay millions of dollars in damages. So even though it was a civil case, he still ended up with a big financial penalty. And this all happened after he became president, right?
That's right, yeah. It shows that being president doesn't make you immune from civil lawsuits.
Wow. And speaking of money, we can't forget about that huge fraud judgment against the president and his company.
Right.
The one from the New York Attorney General.
Yeah, that was a big one. Almost $478 million.
That's a lot of money.
It is. And the New York Attorney General has made it clear that she plans to go after that money. And that's likely to put a lot of pressure on the president, both legally and financially, for years to come.
So to recap, we've got these civil cases, the January 6th lawsuits, the sexual abuse case, and that massive fraud judgment. And all of those are happening completely separate from those criminal cases. It's kind of like a legal hydra. You cut off one head, and two more grow back.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. It really captures the complexity of this whole thing.
Uh-huh.
But beyond the legal stuff, I think we need to step back for a second and think about the bigger picture.
What do you mean?
Well, we've talked about what might happen legally. But what about the impact all of this will have on the presidency itself?
Right.
Will the president even be able to govern effectively with all of this going on? Will it take up all his time and energy and make it harder for him to focus on, policy and leadership?
Yeah, and what about his relationships with other world leaders? How's this going to affect his standing on the global stage? I can't imagine it's going to help.
It definitely adds another layer of complication. And then there's public perception. Will all of this just further divide the country?
Right.
Will it erode people's trust in our institutions and make them even more cynical about politics?
Those are all big questions, and I don't think anyone has the answers right now.
Yeah,
But it's definitely uncharted territory, and the stakes are incredibly high.
it really is.
Yeah.
This situation forces us to think about some really fundamental questions about power, about accountability, about the rule of law.
Absolutely.
And it challenges us to really think about what kind of society we want to live in. What values do we prioritize?
Well said, well said. So, where does this leave us? We have a president facing a mountain of legal challenges, criminal and civil. No easy answers in sight. What's the takeaway for our listeners?
Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.
Yeah.
This is a turning point in our history. The decisions we make in the next few years will have a huge impact on the future of our democracy.
I completely agree. We can't just sit back and watch this happen. We have to hold our leaders accountable. We have to demand transparency, and we have to participate in the conversation about what's happening. The future of our country depends on it.
I agree. And even with all of this complexity, all of this uncertainty, there is still hope. The pursuit of justice might be slow, it might be difficult, but it's absolutely essential for any democracy.
Right.
As long as we're committed to that pursuit, we can be confident that our system, even with its flaws, can ultimately prevail.
That's a great point, and I think it's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. And remember, this is just the beginning. We'll continue to follow these developments and provide updates as they happen.
Absolutely. Stay tuned.